Now we move on to the leftist or Marxist critique of imperialism and its own critics. The Marxist analysis of imperialism did not begin with Karl, but with Rosa. In 1913, Rosa Luxemburg published her Accumulation of Capital, in which the author proposed that imperialism was military conquest intended to repress the workers inside and outside of state borders, a consequence of class struggle. Transformation of surplus value into investment capital could not be achieved without exploiting pre-capitalist societies. Once the pre-capitalist regions of the world had been absorbed into the imperial capitalist system, it would somehow collapse. Vladimir Lenin followed Luxemburg, Hobson, and Rudolf Hilferding, who wrote Finance Capital in 1910, with the notion that imperialism was a temporary postponement of the death of capitalism itself. Lenin wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism in 1916 during World War I. He said European capitalists were intent on robbing the workers to build colonial empires and enrich themselves. The finance capitalists partitioned the planet economically, and then the great powers stepped in and formalized the process. For Lenin, the next stage in imperialism was European breakdown from nationalist wars over repartitioning the entire planet. The problem with Lenin's analysis was that it did not recognize the liquidity of capital and its transnational employment by multinational corporations. Capitalism would survive as empires fell and disappeared in 1918. Lenin's call to make the imperialist war into a class war failed to inspire the masses, who preferred nationalism to communism. Nevertheless, both Lenin and his successor, Joseph Stalin, moved the center of Marxist analysis away from the metropole towards the periphery of imperialism. The crisis of capitalism was fast approaching, according to Stalin. World War I was not enough of a capitalist war to destroy it, apparently. Capitalist imperialism had to be overturned from the colonial periphery itself, with the help of European proletarians under communist leadership, which meant Moscow. The eruption of fascism in the 1930s seemed to prove that capitalism was in its last stage of decrepitude, but the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939 put paid to Marxist theorizing, and in 1956, the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party declared peaceful coexistence with capitalism. Perhaps the final variant of Leninist analysis of imperialism was the Maoist incarnation, that imperialism is the influence of the West over the Third World, a conspiracy of finance capitalists and native elite collaborators to oppress the masses. Only war would liberate the masses from imperialism. It was inevitable. Somehow the peasantry would leap ahead of the proletariat, which was impossible according to Karl Marx, and overthrow the wicked capitalists. Eventually Maoism even tagged the USSR as imperialist. Marxism-Leninism-Maoism seemed to have reached a dead end as a predictive theory, because capitalism has survived imperialist war in 1914, world depression in 1929, fascist war in 1940, and colonial liberation in the 1960s. Apparently the Marxist critique joined postmodernism in the work of Negri and Hardt to declare that imperialism is over, replaced by empire, which equals global sovereignty. This thing called empire is outside of history, but something they call the multitude will overthrow it eventually. Imperialism as objective process is a more charitable view, seeing colonization as a favor to the backward peoples of the world. Thus, imperialism is the spread of Western civilization over primitive social orders based on superior technology and the energy of colonists. Natives raised few objections to the process, after all. A variation of this view sees imperialism as a complex relationship of advanced Western countries with less advanced peoples in which a simple power imbalance is exploited by the West through the agency of militarism, trade, and culture. Some imperialist writers may have actually believed their propaganda about the bestowal of gifts to the benighted peoples of the world. The Englishman Joseph Chamberlain said imperial takeovers were designed for both commercial development and as trustees for civilization and the betterment of mankind. Some scholars interpret colonial annexation and expansion as signs of decline. Bernard Porter thought the British civilizing mission of Christ and free trade failed to hide three contradictions within imperialism. First, that freeborn Englishmen were propping up native tyrants. Second, military aggression on the periphery led to insecurity and not stability. Third, if the other empires were a threat, then why did they not join forces against Britain? Imperialism has also been seen as a domestic political distraction tactic. Hans-Ulrich Wehler argued that Otto von Bismarck's imperialism was the result of domestic political considerations. Nationalist movements and peripheral relationships in the non-European world had nothing to do with the German and colonial empire. Wehler argued that Bismarck yielded to the demands of bourgeois capitalists for overseas empire, only for the sake of domestic political tranquility. To preserve the status quo in Germany, Bismarck followed a course of social imperialism. In other words, assuring the independence of the military from government influence maintained by a conservative bureaucracy, enacting a social policy to appease the workers while trying to stifle socialism. Imperialism was used as an ideological force for social integration. In the words of Wehler, social imperialism served to defend the traditional social and power structures of the Prusso-German state and to shield them from the turbulent effects of industrialization, as well as from the movements towards parliamentarization and democratization. Last but not least, it served to keep the Bonapartist dictator in power. At bottom, Wehler's is not an economic theory, but a socio-political one focusing on the single-minded class interest of the ruling elite. After 1965, critics of capitalism found another causative agent behind imperialism in the multinational corporation. Tom Kemp viewed imperialism as the corporations working as an ideal collective capitalist agency, which blurred the distinction between state and business interests, public and private capital. Imperialism is thus the informal world economic rule by corporations based in the United States. Harry Magdoff saw economic rule by big capitalist monopolies as the basis of modern imperialism, even after the end of colonialism, which was but a training interval for post-colonial dependence. The global rule of multinational corporations based in the West was the background for Kwame Nkrumah's thesis that corrupt mismanagement by collaborationist regimes in the Third World kept nations from advancing due to unequal development programs. Finally, imperialism has been viewed as structural violence, notably in Johan Galtung's Strukturelle Gewalt, published in 1975. This is the domination of one organized community over another in asymmetrical relations of imperial core and colonized periphery, in which the core establishes a bridgehead in a peripheral country with help from an indigenous elite. Imperialism relies on structural violence against a society rather than upon military might. The problem with Galtung's idea is that poor countries operate under homegrown dictators, not collaborationist regimes. The West does not always hold all the cards. As Theodore Mommsen pointed out, the problem in the less developed countries is not capital coming in from the West, but getting the capital in at all. The notion of a super imperialism of the United States and its corporations ruling an international capitalist class without the need for formal rule because the entire planet has been colonized by capitalism is a bit tautological. If multinational corporations are no longer nation-based, then how does one nation dominate the others? This is your Empire historian, Frank H. Wallis, Ph.D. Thank you for listening and thinking.